Welcome to In Talks With, conversations exploring culture with me, Danielle. The American photographer Peter Hujar came to recognition for his gritty, tough and glamorous black and white images of the downtown New York scene taken during the 1970s and 80s. Until his untimely death in 1987, he was a key player in the group of artists, musicians, writers and performers who made the city so compelling at this time, and he left behind a complex and profound body of work that has become posthumously celebrated. Ahead of a show of his work at Maureen Paley in London, I had the good fortune to speak to Maureen, and also later to the writer and photography critic Vince Aletti, who was Peter's close friend, neighbour, fellow partygoer and portrait sitter. The Maureen Paley show of Peter's work features a series of images that captures performers backstage in New York theatres and nightclubs during the late 70s and early 80s, as well as portraits of his contemporaries from the downtown New York scene at that time, such as Fran, Lebowitz, John Waters and Divine. I asked Maureen why she felt like now was the time to do a show of Peter's work and to share her thoughts on what makes his work so special.
Well, we've been showing Peter Hujar for quite some time, and I think that we feel very dedicated to his work and very interested in the work that he's presenting in this show, specific to the fact that so many places that people would be looking at performance are unable to be open because of the pandemic, and it seemed to us to be a very crucial time to show something of the backstage that fascinated him. And he was very much an insider in terms of who he took pictures of and the confidence people had in him and his ability to kind of float and be in the worlds that he was photographing. It wasn't that he was coming to them voyeuristically from the outside. It was very much that he was an insider.
And what's your experience with Peter Hujar? How did he come to be on your radar? You seem very closely associated with him.
Well, I think that one of the things that had happened is that through Vince Aletti, who I believe you've also spoken with, Vince was friendly with Peter Hujar and in fact, lived very, very near to him in the Lower East Side of New York. We were, through Vince, very, very lucky and able to, at a Paul Tech exhibition in New York that was at the Whitney Museum, we were able to meet with the executor of the estate, who had looked after that all the way through the time that Peter Hujar had died of AIDS, and was very, very faithfully and carefully looking after the estate. So we met with him in New York, and we talked more about being able to do some shows with work by Peter. And I think that normally I'm quite reluctant to take on estates of artists, especially if I've not met them or known them. But I think through Vince and through his, friendship with Peter, and an affinity that I had for the work, I felt more comfortable doing it. I had come across the Hujar work before actually talking to Vince, when Wolfgang Tillmans had a show at PS1 in New York. And there was a show that Bob Nickus had curated, a very extensive survey show of Hujar's work. And it was actually on the same floor as the Tillmans work was. And I had been there visiting for Wolfgang, but went down and looked in great detail and kind of, for a long, long time at the Hujar. And I think one of the things that really struck me when looking at the work was the range of work. I was aware of certain iconic images. I was aware of Candy Darling on her deathbed. I had been aware of some of the Palermo images. I had known about his friendship and love affairs with Paul Tech and with David Wojnarowicz. And I'd known about his life, but I really was intrigued that there were so many photographs of animals and photographs of landscape and cityscape. So there's so much. And I remember it like logged in my mind then that it would be wonderful to do something at some point. And I didn't know when that would come, but he was somebody that I was aware of. And we felt so lucky to be able to early on show a series of portraits together with Palermo photographs of the catacombs, and also show some of his coquette portraits. So these are all, quite known. And that was like our first foray into doing a solo show after Vince had done his male show.
That's really fascinating. And so do you think, you've mentioned that there are some of those photos that people do know about, but do you think that there is then this whole cache of Peter Hujar imagery that people aren't aware of or aren't aware of enough yet?
Well, I think that there was a very, very large exhibition that, has recently toured, that was at the Morgan Library, that was very special and important, that was called Speed of Life. And that has allowed people to see quite a range of the work, and was a very, very popular show recently in New York. But it is true that I think people might not be as aware of all of the pictures that he's taken. And one of the things I think that's very crucial and very hard for people to possibly understand in our period is that when he was working, it was a time where he was very much understood by certain people, but not collected widely. And he didn't get to print all of the works that he had made in all their editions or have them sold in all their editions. So he was somehow celebrated in the demi-monde, but very much, not fully looked at in terms of being as established as he might have hoped to be. And I think that the estate, and particularly the person who's looking after it, the executor of the estate, who is a lawyer that he knew, who he entrusted to really look after his work, made a very big point of saying to him that if and when it became necessary, it was very important to him that his work would get recognized even posthumously, because he died very young of AIDS. I mean, he died at 53.
Yeah, so was it 1987?
Yes, it was. And so he didn't really, get to have the full arc of his life, where he would have, possibly been taken up. And he possibly might not have been in that period. But I think he would have wished for more to happen. And he entrusted them and said, and this is very, very interesting, because collectors are often mesmerized by the idea of lifetime prints and looking at, vintage prints that would be printed by him. And he was a master printer and had a very fascinating kind of relationship to printing that I was just reading about, because he kind of believed that every print kind of had its own character, its own meaning. And he didn't want every print to be the same. So when he was printing something out of an edition, there was a lot of interpretation that he allowed. And that's not how we tend to think of things now. But it was also true that he didn't get to print everything in an edition because nothing was selling. So he had said to the estate, the people who are now, executors of the estate, that he wanted things to be able to be printed posthumously from his negatives. And he wanted certain iconic images to be truly taken up and appreciated perhaps later on. So he's very savvy about that. And he was very specific about that. And I think that, particularly knowing that he was dying young and that he didn't wish to be, suffering with AIDS, I think he was very specific about what he hoped for in terms of his work. And when I decided to work with him, I felt that we were in some way taking up his death wish, like taking up his wish to be more known. And in fact, this podcast is part of that.
It's so fascinating. And why do you think he hasn't been celebrated as much as his contemporaries? Like you think of, Robert Mapplethorpe and Nan Goldin.
Nan lived longer and she was taken up by certain specific people. I think that Robert Mapplethorpe had many people championing him, in particular Sam Wagstaff. I think that Peter was known to be quite particular and maybe somewhat difficult and dismissive of aspects of the market and his own worst enemy, as many artists can be. So he just didn't have as wide a reach. And it was something that concerned him, that he was quite upset about. But having said that, he really had huge talent, and he has made some very iconic images, and those are now getting the appreciation. And like I say, the Morgan Library show really allowed him to be appreciated. I saw it in a number of locations. One of them was the Jeu de Paume, where it also looked fabulous. And he was a kind of underground star in many ways. I think that, he was kind of like, he did screen tests with Andy Warhol and was one of the 13 most beautiful boys, and kind of hung out in the scene. And I think that Paul Tech, who was close to him, and early on, like when they had met, Paul Tech too died too young and didn't get all the appreciation that he would have wished to.
Really fascinating. Seeing the same exhibition in different locations, did it take on a different meaning or a different inference for you each time you saw it?
Well, I think the Speed of Life show at the Morgan Library and Museum, the Morgan Library is such a fabulous place. And if if you haven't visited it or people don't know of it, they should really visit it when we can next travel and be in New York. So as a library and museum, it's just a very, very special place. So it looked wonderful there. I think that in each place that it went to, it got a little bit of a different interpretation. But I didn't see it in all of its locations, but the two places I did see it, as I say, the Jeu de Paume and the Morgan Library, were very, very, very well installed and very special. And there were different categories of work, different portraits, different landscapes, different self-portraits, different categories of friends and acquaintances. He also did a certain amount, not unlike Diane Arbus, who he had met. He did a certain amount of, inverted commas, commercial work, where he got to meet certain people. So he has portraits of people like, John Waters or people like Peggy Lee. He was interested in performers. He was interested in drag queens. So he was interested in the mask of life. And a lot of photographers are very interested in that. And then he kind of was supporting himself through some of that work.
Let's talk about the images in the exhibition. There's lots of images of the bulk of the show is made of photos of drag artists backstage, applying their makeup, getting ready. Why did these images speak to you, and why did you want to present them?
Well, I think that it was more that I had shown the coquette images that are more known. And I was very interested in these because they were lesser known. And I think that in the Hujar work, there's a certain sensitivity to the reveal. And he's, caught up with a kind of fascination with exposing people like without their mask, and then people like being presented with. I think that I was conscious too of his, I guess, not just showing imagery of people who are downtown figures that were kind of part of the scene, but sort of looking at people who he had come across through like their engagement with theater and I don't know. It was just something that came to us. I think it was because so many theaters are closed, so many places that people would have performed or been able to perform are not open, and one feels a great empathy and sympathy with the performing arts, with the theatrical, with the idea that we want people to be able to continue in those areas of the arts. And I just guess I wanted to explore them like in this show through Hujar now.
That's a really nice thought. And I suppose as well, that's within the kind of broader idea of transgender issues and I think what you called in your press release, the nuances of gender, which I thought was a nice way of putting it. I mean, in a way, do you think he was sort of ahead of his time? Because the images do stand up so well today, and they still feel gritty and modern. They haven't really dated. Would you agree?
I think that's very true. I think that was the thing. I think that he has a certain immediacy in the pictures, and they haven't. In many ways, I think they have a timelessness about them, which is quite fascinating.
For people viewing the images, whether they get to see them in real life or online, what do you hope they'd take away from it?
Well, I guess the thing is that we are like showing like a capsule of something. I think that, there was a very nice portfolio that was printed in the FT recently. And I think that it's just trying to spread the awareness, really. One of the things that I think is fascinating is that in 1967, right, Hujar was selected with some other, younger photographers to take a masterclass, and it was taught by Richard Avedon and Marvin Israel. And he met Diane Arbus then, who was very close to both of them. So I think that he is almost like, it's like presenting something in amber, it's like trying to kind of be of our time and then look back. And I think that the fact that he's no longer with us, but he has a kind of quality for me that just seems very contemporary. I want to keep like creating a need or a kind of a desire to have a connection. And for people who might not have seen my earlier shows, who are younger now and kind of coming to the gallery now, and people who might have seen the earlier shows but still have interest in his work, it seems like it's like the glue. It's just keeping his name afloat, keeping his presence, there, like in our program. When I mentioned that he was in the 3-minute screen tests, and he was also included in the compilation film, The 13 Most Beautiful Boys, right?
Yeah.
I love that he kind of had been living actually in Italy, and he had gotten a Fulbright scholarship, and he went in 1963, and then he returned with Paul Tech, and they went around and looked at the catacombs in Palermo. And all those images are in this book from 1975 called Portraits of Life and Death. But when he returned in 1964 to America, he actually became like an assistant in a studio of a commercial photographer. And that's when he met Andy Warhol. So when we think that all these people are no longer with us, but we're still speaking about them to this day, it's really, to me, quite moving, and it's a thread, like a golden thread to the past, but it also is something that keeps them quite contemporary in the present.
I love that idea, and I'm so grateful to you for being somebody who can continue that thread by telling these stories as well. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Danielle.
Later, I spoke to Vince Aletti to ask him about his friendship with Peter and what it was like to be photographed by him.
I met Peter Hujar through his boyfriend at the time, a guy named Jim Forat, who was a colleague of mine when I was working at CBS Records. Jim was what they called the company freak, a young, very engaged guy who could provide a connection between rock and roll acts and the corporate people. He was smart on kind of both ends of that. And he also became a very significant gay activist. This is 1969, 1970. And I met Peter through Jim and started going out to dinner with them or going to parties with them. And when they broke up, I remained closer friends with Peter than with Jim. Peter was, I loved his work. I found him really engaging and complicated and someone that I just was very drawn to. We lived not far from each other in the East Village when we first got to know one another. We, at the beginning, were kind of friends who went out to parties a lot. I was writing about rock and roll, and there were, again, this is the early 70s, there were a lot of publicity parties for rock bands. Whenever someone put out a new album or was in town to do a performance, that was an excuse to have a cocktail party or some sort of event that would celebrate the release of an album or some kind of, moment in a band's life. And record companies were spending a lot of money on publicity. And so I would get invited to these parties sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. And I would almost always go with Peter because he was so much fun to hang out with. And I had kind of a crush on him at the beginning because he was so engaging and so good looking and just easy to be with and fun to be with at a party. So, there were times when we had not enough money for dinner, but we could go to a cocktail party and have hors d'oeuvres. And that became our social life for a good period of time.
There's a beautiful portrait he took of you from 1975. What was it like to be photographed by him?
I was so grateful that Peter did want to take my picture after knowing him for some time. He was very quiet for the most part in terms of, working with somebody in his apartment, in his loft, which I'd been to a number of times, so it was a comfortable situation for me to be in, but I'm never comfortable having my picture taken. And I think Peter was always used to that with many of his sitters. A lot of what he did was just try to put people at ease, not talk to you too much. I don't remember getting a lot of direction from him, just patience. He was quiet and focused. I think he generally was always waiting for someone to let their guard down. And the session didn't take a long time. I don't think I was there for a long time, and I think after that we went out to dinner. Peter had a sense in his lifetime that his work was good, and if not important, something that would be appreciated after he died. And he was so right about that, obviously. It's painful for friends of his to realize how difficult his life was, just financially and in so many ways, and sad that he wasn't able to experience this, fame and appreciation in his lifetime. He had it from his friends, but that was never enough. You he was hopeful that work would be seen, more broadly and more and with more interest. But it's gratifying to his friends now that there is this recognition, but sad that he didn't have it and couldn't appreciate it while he was alive.
That was an episode of In Talks with me, Danielle Radoichin, speaking to Maureen Paley and Vince Aletti. If you'd like to find out more about the Peter Hujar exhibition, then head to maureenpaley.com. The theme music for this show is by Warren Borg, and the original podcast artwork is by Patrick Waugh. To hear more episodes of the show, hit subscribe in your podcast app, and you can contact me with suggestions and tips for future guests via Instagram by searching for @Danielle Radoichin. Thanks for listening.